another process. Postannular, posterior to an annulus. Postanoxic, following anoxia. Postens. A surname. Postantennal, behind the antenna. Postantennal organ, synonym of organ of tertiary. Postantennal organs, plural of postantennal organ. Postanthesis, occurring after the opening of a flower. Postanthetic, after the opening of a flower. Postantibiotic, following treatment with an antibiotic. Postantifungal, following antifungal treatment. Post-anxiety, after anxiety. Post-aortic, post-apartheid, occurring after a period of apartheid. Post-apical, located behind an apex. Post-apnea, following apnea. Post-apocalypse, the time after the apocalypse. Post-apocalypsis, plural of post-apocalypse. Post-apocalyptic, occurring after an apocalypse or catastrophic event. Post-apoplectic, after apoplexy. Post-apoptotic, following apoptosis. Post-stat, following the introduction of an app or apps in general. Post-appendectomy, after an appendectomy. Post-application, following an application. Post-approval, after approval, especially of a pharmaceutical drug. Post-arcuate, behind the arcuate line. Post-arrest, after an arrest. Post-arrhythmic, that occurs after arrhythmia. Post-arsphenamine, after arsphenamine has been administered. Post-arterial, situated after the arterioles used especially of the capillaries. Post-arthritic, after arthritis. Post-arthroplasty, following arthroplasty. Post-arthroscopic, after an arthroscopy. Post-articular, alternative form of post-articulatory. Post-articulatory, following articulation. Post-asphyxio, following asphyxia. Post-assembly, after assembling. Post-assessment, after an assessment. Post-asthmatic, after the onset of asthma. Post-ethnic, a period in which many messages are posted as to an internet newsgroup or forum. Post-ethens, plural of post-ethen. Post-atomic, after the discovery or use of the atomic bomb. Post-atrial, following an atrial event. Post-attachment, occurring after attachment. Post-attack, after an attack. Post-attack blackmail, the situation in which one state uses nuclear weapons to attack another state's retaliatory forces and then threatens to attack the cities next if the weakened victim state retaliates. Post-attentive, after paying attention. Post-auction, after an auction. Post-edit, after an audit. Post-edited, simple past and past participle of post-edit. Post-editing, present participle and gerund of post-edit. Post-editory, posterior to the auditory region of the brain. Post-edit, third person singular simple present indicative of post-edit. Postorical, alternative form of postauricular. Postauricular, behind external ear. Post-authorization, after authorization. Post-statistic, of or relating to a political movement that criticizes neoclassical economics and advocates a pluralistic approach. Post-autogamous, following autogamy. Post-autopsy, after autopsy. Post-axial, situated behind an axis in the body of an animal, hind, posterior. Postaxial pallidactyles, plural of postaxial pallidactyly. Postaxial pallidactyly, the presence of an additional little finger or equivalent digit in animals. Postaxially, in a postaxial manner or direction. Post-exotomy, following exotomy. Post-nat, flipping of post-baccalaureate. Post-nat, flipping of post-baccalaureate. Post-baccalaureate, subsequent and in addition to the baccalaureate or bachelor's degree. Post-nat, the transmission of data back to the same web page by means of HTTP posts. Post-nax, plural of post-bag. Post-tag, a bag used for carrying post-mail. Post-tags, plural of post-bag. Post-bailout, following a bailout, especially a government bailout of private business. Post-bankruptcy, after bankruptcy. Post-baptismal, after baptism. Post-bariatric, after bariatric surgery. Post-base, a morpheme used as a suffix following either a base or another post-base. Post-baseline, after a baseline has been established. Post-base, plural of post-base. Post-basic, following a basic level. Post-act, after a bath. Post-battle, after a battle. Post-behavioral, after the decline of behavioralism. Post-behavioralism, a reaction against the dominance of behavioralist methods in the study of politics, claiming that behavioralist research was biased towards the status quo and social preservation rather than social change. Post-behavioralists, a proponent of post-behavioralism. Post-behavioralists, plural of post-behavioralists. Post-bellum, of the period following a war. Post-biblical, after the publication of the Bible. Post-biblically, after the publication of the Bible. Post-bifurcal, alternative form of post-bifurcation. Post-bifurcation, following bifurcation. Post-binge, following a binge, especially a drinking binge. Post-biological, after the biological phase. Post-biopsy, following a biopsy. Post-biosynthetic, following biosynthesis. Post-biosynthetically, in a post-biosynthetic manner. Post-biotic, any metabolite of a probiotic compound. Post-biotics, plural of post-biotic. Post-birth, postnatal. Post-black, of or relating to a paradoxical form of black racial identity that rejects the notion that race matters. Post-blackness, the quality of being post-black. Post-blastodermal, following formation of a blastoderm. Post-bleach, after a bleaching operation. Post-bleaching, after bleaching. Post-doom, after a boom. Post-boomer, after the baby boomers. Post-boomers, plural of post-boomer. Post-deuce, after a boost. Post-up, a form of small group jazz music that emerged in the early 1960s under the influence of artists such as Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock. Post-bottleneck. Following a bottleneck, typically a population bottleneck. Post-bounce, describing the period following the bounce of a collapsing stellar core. Post-Versailles, relating to a period of society following the decline of the bourgeoisie. Post-box, alternative spelling of post-box. Post-boxes, plural of post-box, alternative spelling of post-box. Post-boxing, after a career in the sport of boxing. Post-die, a male postilion. Post-base, plural of post-boy. Post-bracial, hysterectomy. Post-brachytherapy, after brachytherapy. Post-branchial, hysteria the gills. Post-break, following a break. Post-breakfast, after breakfast. Post-breakup, occurring after a breakup. Post-breeding, after finishing breeding. Post-broadcast, after a broadcast. Post-bronchial, posterior to the bronchus. Post-bronchodilation, following bronchodilation. Post-bronchodilator, after the use of a bronchodilator. Post-bronchoscopic, after bronchoscopy. Post-bubble, occurring after the collapse of an economic bubble. Post-backle, posterior to the mouth. Post-backling, following and especially as a result of buckling. Post-build, alternative form of post-build. Post-bulbar, distal to the duodenal bulb. Post-bureaucratic, after a period of bureaucracy. Post-burn, after a burn. Post-burst, after a burst or occurring after a burst. Postless, a mail delivery vehicle that also serves as a bus for passengers, typically in areas with limited public transport. Postbuses, plural of postbus. Post-bayas, after a bayas. Post-pass, following a bypass. Post-kekal, anterior to the kegum. Post-calcarine, behind the calcarine. Sulcus. Post-campaign, after a political campaign. Post-cancer, after the onset of cancer. Post-canine, situated behind the canine teeth. Post-canines, plural of post-canine. Post-caniniform, having the form of a post-canine tooth. Post-canon, post-dating the development of a religious canon. Post-canonical, after the development of a religious canon. Post-capillaries, plural of post-capillary. Post-capillary, to the venous side of a capillary. Post-capitalism, any hypothetical economic system proposed as a future replacement for capitalism. Post-capitalist, after capitalism. Post-capitalists, plural of post-capitalists. Post-captain, alternative form of post-captain. Post-captains, plural of post-captain. Post-capture, after a capture of image data, a criminal, etc. Postcard, a rectangular piece of thick paper or thin cardboard, typically used for sending messages by mail without the need for an envelope. Postcarded, simple past and past participle of postcard. Post-cardiac. Following cardiac injury or disease. Postcardial. Behind the heart. Postcardinal. Posterior to the cardinal vein. Postcarding. The sending of postcards. Postcardiotomy. After cardiotomy. Postcardioversion. After cardioversion. Postcardish. Tweely picturesque. Postcard-like. Resembling or characteristic of a postcard. Picturesque. Postcards. Plural of postcard. Postcardware. A software product whose author requests as payment a postcard from the user's hometown. Postcard. Tweely picturesque. Postcare. After medical or psychiatric care. Post-career. Following the end of one's current or primary career. Post-careers. Plural of post-career. Postcart. A cart used to deliver the post. Postcarts. Plural of postcart. Post-castration. Following castration. Post-cataclysmic. After a cataclysm. Post-cataract. After cataract. Post-catastrophic. After a catastrophe. Post-catheterization. Alternative form of post-catheterization. Post-catheterization. Alternative form of post-catheterization. Post-caucus. After a caucus. Post-caudal. Behind or under the tail. Post-caustic. Following destruction of tissue. Post-cava. In the vena cava. Post-cavi. Plural of post-cava. Post-caval. Posterior to the vena cava. Post-cavals. Plural of post-caval. Post-seed. To come after something or someone chronologically. Post-seeding. Simple past and past participle of post-seed. Post-seeds. Third person singular simple present indicative of post-seed. Post-seeding. Present participle and gerund of post-seed. Post-cellularization. Following cellularization. Post-cementation. After cementation. Post-censal. After a census. Post-census. After a census. Post-central. Posterior to the central sulcus. Post-centrally. In a post-central direction or position. Post-centrifugation. After centrifugation. Post-cephalic. Behind.
Here we go.
The head. Post-cerebellar. Posterior to the cerebellum. Post-cerebral. Posterior cerebral. Post-cervical. Beyond the cervix. Post-cesarean. Following a cesarean section. Post-cessation. After something has ceased. Post-ketal. Posterior to the kidney. Post-chase. Alternative form of post-chase. Post-chase. Chases. Plural of post-chase. Post-chalazal. Beyond a chalaza in the outer integument. Post-challenge. Following a metabolic challenge. Post-chaperonin. Following modification by a chaperonin. Post-chemotherapeutic. After chemotherapy. Post-chemotherapy. After chemotherapy. Post-chiasmatic. Behind a chiasma. Post-chiasmic. located after a chiasma. Post-chlorination, the addition of chlorine to the treated water right before it is distributed. Post-chonal, posterior to achona. Post-cholecystectomy, after cholecystectomy. Post-chorus, alternative form of post-chorus. Post-chroming, synonym of after-chroming. Post-sebal, synonym of postprandial. Post-sebally, synonym of postprandially. In a post-sebal manner. Post-ciliary, behind a cilium. Post-cymatic, after the invention of cinema.
Invincible.
Post-singular, behind a cingulum. Post-cingulate, a thin ridge surrounding the posterior or distalmost aspects of a lower molar crown. The post-cingulate is typically located on the distal margin of the talonid, below the hypoconid, hypoconulid, and entocconid. Post-cingulates, plural of post-cingulate. Post-cingulum, a small ridge behind a cingulum on a tooth. Post-circumcision, following circumcision. Post-civilization, after civilization. Post-class, occurring after a class is finished. Post-classic, after a classic period. Post-classical, after the classical era but sometimes before the medieval. Post-classically, in a post-classical manner. Post-clavicle, a bone in the pectoral girdle of many fishes projecting backward from the clavicle. Postclavicles, plural of postclavicle. Postclavicular, posterior to the clavicle. Post-cleavage, following cleavage. Post-cleaferal, posterior to a cleaferum. Post-cleaferum, a bone in the pectoral girdle of telost fishes. Post-climacteric, synonym of postmenopausal. Post-climactic, after a climax. Post-climax, after the point of climax. Post-clinic, after a clinic. Post-clitic, an unemphatic word stressed as part of the preceding word. Post-clitical, post-clitic. Post-clitics, plural of post-clitic. Post-cloacal, posterior to the cloaca. Post-closure, after closure. Post-clypal, posterior to a clypeus. Post-clypeus, the upper proximal portion of the clypeus in insects such as the cicada. Post-techlear, behind the cochlear. Postcode, a sequence of letters and numbers added to a postal address to aid the sorting and delivery of post or mail. Postcode lotteries, plural of postcode lottery. Postcode lottery, the unequal availability or quality of services, especially public services such as health care or education, in different parts of the country. Postcode war, gang violence between people who live in different postcode areas. Postcode wars, plural of postcode war. Postcoded, having a postcode. Postcodes, plural of postcode. Postcoding, present participle and gerund of postcode. Postcognition, retrocognition. Postcognitions, plural of postcognition. Postpidal, occurring after or as a consequence of sex. Postcoital dysphoria, synonym of postcoital tristes. Postcoital test, a laboratory test which examines the cervical mucus in the postcoital period for the evaluation of infertility. Postcoital tests, plural of postcoital tests. Postcoital tristesse, a feeling of sadness, anxiety, irritability, or agitation experienced by some individuals after consensual sexual activity. Postcoitally, after coitus. Postcoitum, synonym of postcoital. Postcoitus, appear immediately at coitus. Post-collapse, after a collapse. Post-college, occurring after one's college, especially the undergraduate education. Post-collegiate, occurring after graduation from college. Post-collicular, posterior to a colliculus. Post-collision, after collision. Post-collisional, after collision. Post-collusion, after collusion. Post-colonial, following the end of colonial rule. Post-colonial anarchism, a tendency within the anarchist movement emphasizing anti-imperialism, indigenism, and opposing ethnic supremacist views such as Eurocentrism. Post-colonial studies, the study of the cultural legacies of colonialism and imperialism. Post-colonialism, post-colonialism, an era or attitude relating to the period after the settlement of one country by another, or very broadly, after the 1960s, when many colonized countries gained their independence. Post-colonialisms, plural of post-colonialism. Post-colonialists, synonym of post-colonial. Post-colonialists, plural of post-colonialists. Post-colonialities, plural of post-coloniality. Post-coloniality, equality post-colonial. Post-colonially, after colonization. Post-colonials, plural of post-colonial. Post-colonoscopic,
Here we go.
following colonoscopy. Post-column, describing any process carried out on the materials leaving a chromatography column. Post-combat, that happens after combat. Post-combustion, following combustion. Post-commissural, the spelling of post-commissural. Post-commissural, posterior to a commissure. Post-commissure, a transverse commissure in the posterior part of the roof of the third ventricle of the brain, the posterior cerebral commissure. Post-commissures, plural of post-commissure. Post-commissurotomy, after commissurotomy. Post-communion, the concluding portion of the communion service. Post-communions, plural of post-communion. Post-communism, the period of political and economic transformation or transition in former communist states located in parts of Europe and Asia in which new governments aim to create free market-oriented capitalist economies. Post-communists, after communism. Post-communists, plural of post-communists. Post-commute, after a commute. Post-completion, after completion. Post-compose, to apply an operation after another operation has occurred. Post-conception, following conception. Post-conceptional, after conception, the fusion of gametes to produce a new organism. Post-conceptionally, after conceiving a child. Post-conceptive, following conception. Post-conceptual, relating to post-conceptualism. Post-conceptualism, an art theory that builds upon the legacy of conceptual art. Post-conceptualists, one who studies or produces works in post-conceptualism. Post-conceptualists, plural of post-conceptualists. Post-concert, occurring after a concert. Post-conciliar, in or of the period following an ecclesiastical council, especially the Second Vatican Council. Post-concussion, occurring after or as a consequence of a concussion. Post-concussional, after a concussion. Post-concussive, post-concussion. Post-concussive syndrome, synonym of post-concussion syndrome. Post-concussive syndromes, plural of post-concussive syndrome. Post-condition, a condition that must be met immediately after execution of some piece of code. Post-conditional, relating to a post-condition. Post-condition, condition following some other process. Post-conditioning, after conditioning. Post-conditions, plural of post-condition. Post-condilar, posterior to the condyle. Post-confinement, following confinement. Post-conflict, occurring after a conflict. Post-confluence, alternative form of post-confluent. Post-confluency, synonym of post-confluent. Post-confluent, following confluence of cells. Post-connubio, after getting married. Post-conquest, after a conquest. Post-conscious, occurring after conscious mental processing. Post-consonantal, following or occurring after a consonant. Post-consonantally, following or occurring after a consonant. Post-conspiracy, after a conspiracy. Post-constitutional, after the adoption or decline of a political constitution. Post-constitutionally, after the adoption or decline of a political constitution. Post-construction, occurring after construction. Post-consultation, after consultation. Post-consumer, after use by a consumer. Post-consumerism, a value system that follows and rejects or moves beyond consumerism. Post-consumerist, relating to post-consumerism. Post-contact, following contact. Post-contractual, after the introduction of a contact. Post-contrast, following administration of a contrast medium. Post-controversial, after a controversy. Post-controversy, after a controversy. Post-convalescence, the period of time that follows convalescence. Post-convalescent, after convalescence. Post-convention, after a convention. Post-conventional, belonging to the last of Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development involving the social contract, orientation, and universal ethical principles. Post-convergence, following convergence. Post-convergent, following convergence. Post-conversion, after conversion. Post-conviction, occurring after a judicial conviction. Post-convulsive, following a convulsion. Post-cooling, after cooling. Post-coordination, coordination following some other operation. Post-coordinations, plural of post-coordination. Post-copulation, following copulation. Post-copulatory, occurring after copulation. Post-coracoid, behind the coracoid process. Post-cornu, the posterior horn of each lateral ventricle of the brain. Postcornual, plural of postcorneal. Postcoronary, after coronary thrombosis. Postcoronavirus, after the COVID-19 pandemic. Postcoronal, behind the coronoid. Postcorporate, following the corporate, after the decline of corporations. Postcorrective, following a correction. Postcorrelation, happening after correlation. Postcosmic, after the origination or the end of the universe. Postcastal, posterior to the rib. Postcotyloid, behind the cotyloid cavity. Postcount, a tally or measurement that is performed after some reference to event. Post-countercultural, occurring after a countercultural period, especially referring to the counterculture of the 1960s. Post-counterstain, counterstain following some other procedure. Post-counts, plural of post-count. Post-coup, after a coup. Post-course, following a course, such as of training or medical treatment. Postcranial, plural of postcranial. Postcranial, relating to the postcranium, the portion of the vertebrate skeleton located caudal to the cranium that is, in bipeds, inferior to it. Postcranially, posterior to the cranium. Postcraniotomy, following a craniotomy. Postcranium, the portion of the vertebrate skeleton located caudal to the cranium that is, in bipeds, inferior to it. Postcrash, after a crash vehicle accident. Post-creole, after a creole, after decreolization has taken place. Post-creoles, plural of post-creole. Post-cricoid, behind the cricoid cartilage. Post-crime, after a crime. Post-crisis, after a crisis. Post-crist, an enamel ridge that connects hypoconid and hypoconulate of some molars. Postcristids, plural of postcristid. Postcritical, following criticism, after all criticism has ended. Postcritically, in a postcritical manner. Postcruciate, posterior to the cruciate sulbus. Postcrural, posterior to the leg or thigh. Postcria preserved, following cryopreservation. Postcrystallization, alternative form of postcrystallization. Postcrystallization, alternative form of postcrystallization. Postcubital, posterior to the cubit. Postcubitus, one of the major veins of the insect wing between the cubitus and the anal veins, although it was originally considered one of the anal veins itself. Post-Q, a Q received afterwards. Post-Q'd, simple past and past participle of post-Q. Post-Q's, plural of post-Q. Post-Qing, present participle and gerund of post-Q. Post-cumulus, after the formation of cumulate rocks. Post-curfew, after a curfew. Post-cursor, of intersymbol interference caused by the preceding symbol. Post-cursory, being or relating to a post-cursor. Post-custodial, of or relating to an approach to preservation that focuses on collaborative management of artifacts rather than custodianship over a closed repository. Post-cyberpunk, a fiction genre arising from cyberpunk and and other science fiction without the presence of dystopia associated with cyberpunk. Post-cycloplegia, alternative form of post-cycloplegic. Post-cycloplegic, following cycloplegia. Post-cytochrome, following the release of a cytochrome. Post-cytokinetic, following cytokinesis. Post-date, to occur after an event or time, to exist later on in time. Post-dated, that has occurred after an event or time, that exists later on in time. Post-dates, plural of post-date. Post-dating, a later citation of a lexical item. Post-datings, plural of post-dating. Post-dower, a stage in the development of nematode larvae following dower, the organism at this stage. Post-hours, plural of post-hour. Post-dawn, after dawn, especially within a few hours after.
Here we go.
Post-deadline, after a deadline. Post-deal, after completion of a business deal. Post-destringency, following destringency. Post-deb. Clipping of post-debutante. Post-debate, after a debate. Post-debriefing, after debriefing. Post-debs, plural of post-deb. Post-debutante, a young woman who has made her formal appearance in society. Post-debutantes, plural of post-debutante. Post-decease, to die later than. Post-decease, simple past and past participle of post-decease. Post-deceases, third person singular simple present indicative of post-decease. Post-deceasing, present participle and gerund of post-decease. Post-decimal, following a decimal point. Post-decisional, occurring after a decision is made. Post-decisional regret, synonym of buyer's remorse, a feeling of regret after any kind of decision. Post-deconstructive, pertaining to or characteristic of a style of analysis moving beyond deconstructionism. Post-degree, after a degree. Post-decrement, alternative form of post-decrement. Post-decretal, after the issuing of a decree. Post-defection, after defection. Post-effervescence, after effervescence. Post-deglacial, after deglaciation. Posterior, posterior to adere. Post-delivery, after a delivery of, for example, mail or goods. Post-democracies, plural of post-democracy. Post-democracy, alternative spelling of post-democracy. Post-democratic, alternative spelling of post-democratic. Post-dental, produced by placing the tip of the tongue at the back of the upper front teeth. Post-dentals, plural of post-dental. Post-dentary, posterior to the dentary bone. Post-departure, after departure. Post-deployment, after deployment. Post-depositational, misspelling of post-depositional. Post-deposition, occurring after deposition. Post-depositional. Occurring after deposition. Post-depositionally, in a post-depositional manner after deposition. Post-depression, after an economic depression. Post-depressive, following a state of depression, unhappy state of mind. Post-deprivation, after a period of deprivation. Post-dermabrasion, after dermabrasion. Post-determinative, synonym of post-determiner. Post-determinatives. Plural of post-determinative. Post-determiner. A term or phrase that follows a determiner in a noun phrase and modifies the head noun. Post-determiners. Plural of post-determiner. Post-evaluation. After a financial devaluation. Post-developmental. That follows development. Post-developmentally. Following development. Post-diagnosis. After diagnosis. Post-diagnostic. Following diagnosis. Post-diagnostically. In a post-diagnostic manner. Post-dialysis. After dialysis. Post-dialytic. Following dialysis. Post-diapause. Following diapause. Post-diastole. Posterior to a diastema. Post-diastolic. After diastole. Post-dioxic. Following dioxic growth. Post-dict. To estimate or suppose something which took place in past. To conjecture something that occurred beforehand. Post-dictatorial. After a dictatorship has ended. Post-dictatorship. The government after a dictatorship has ended. Post-dictatorships. Plural of post-dictatorship. Post-dicted. Simple past and past participle of post-dict. Post-dicting. Present participle and gerund of post-dict. Post-diction. The construction of past conditions by relying on the present. Post-dictions. Plural of post-diction. Post-dictive. Relating to post-diction. Post-dictively. By the use of post-diction. Post-dictiveness. The condition of being post-dictive. Post-dictor. Evidence of post-diction. Post-dictors. Plural of post-dictor. Post-dicts. Third person singular simple present indicative of post-dict. Post-differentiation. Following differentiation. Post-digestion. After digestion. Post-digestive. After digestion. Post-digital. Of or relating to a movement that renounces digital technology in favor of a return to a human approach. Post-dilatation. Dilatation following another procedure. Post-dilatations. Plural of post-dilatation. Post-dilate. To dilate after another process. Post-dilated. Simple past and past participle of post-dilate. Post-dilation. Dilation of a blood vessel following some other operation. Post-dilution. Following dilution. Post-diluvial. After the biblical flood. Post-diluvian. Post-diluvial. Post-diluvians. Plural of post-diluvian. Post-dinner. After dinner. Post-diphtherial. Subsequent to diphtheria. Post-diphtheric. Following diphtheria. Post-diphtheritic. After diphtheria. Post-directional. The cardinal or ordinal direction following a street name in some grid-based address systems. Post-disaster. Occurring after a disaster. Post-discal. Relating to an area of an insect's wing or elytron beyond the discal part. Post-discharge. Occurring after discharge, especially discharge from a hospital, military service, or other institution. Post-disco. Alternative form of post-disco. Post-dispersal. following dispersal. Post-displacement, after displacement. Post-dissation, synonym of redisseason. Post-distress, after distress.
Here we go.
Post-distribution, after a distribution. Posted, after a dive. Post-divestiture, after divestiture. Post-divorce, after divorce. Postdoc, a postdoctoral academic research position. Postdocs, plural of postdoc. Postdoctoral, after receiving a doctorate, especially of academic research or study beyond the level of a doctoral degree. Postdoctorally, after completing a doctorate. Postdoctorals, plural of postdoctoral. Postdoctorate, postdoctoral. Postdoctorates, plural of postdoctorate. Post-domestication, following domestication. Post-dominance, the property of a node that post-dominates another. Post-dominant, that post-dominates. Post-dominate, a node Z post-dominates a node N if all paths to the exit node of the graph starting at N must go through Z. Post-dominated, simple past and past participle of post-dominate. Post-dominates, third person, in singular simple present indicative of post-dominate. Post-dominate, present participle and gerund of post-dominate. Post-dominator, a node that post-dominates another. Post-dominators, plural of post-dominator. Post-donation, after or following a donation. Post-dorsal, behind the back. Post-dose, occurring after a dose has been administered. Post-dosing, after the administration of a dose. Post-draft, happening after a draft. Post-dramatic, being or relating to an avant-garde form of theater since the end of the 1960s, which strives to produce an effect amongst the spectators rather than to remain true to its text. Post-Dresenin, following the introduction of Dresenin in an environment. Post-drilling, after drilling. Post-drama, of or pertaining to a postdrome. Post-drome, the set of symptoms that persist after a condition typically in migraine has passed. Postdromes, plural of postdrome. Post-drug, after a drug is administered. Postectal, distal to or downstream of a ductus, for example, the ductus arteriosus. Postural, posterior to the duramater. Post-dynastic, after the rule of a dynasty. Post-dysenteric, following dysentery. Post-restant, a postal service in which a mail is held at a post office to be collected by the recipient. Post-haste, alternative form of post-haste. Post-death, the return of the judge before whom the cause was tried after a verdict of what was done in the cause which is endorsed on the Nicephorus record. Post-earthquake, finding place after an earthquake. Post-dis, plural of post-dip. Post-eclipse, after an eclipse. Post-eclosion, following eclosion. Posted, simple past and past participle of post. Posted, simple past and past participle of post. Posted off, simple past and past participle of post off. Posted price, the price at which oil companies offered to purchase oil from oil-producing governments, set by the oil companies and used to calculate the share of oil revenues that oil-producing countries would receive. Posted prices, plural of posted price. Posted the coal, simple past and past participle of post the coal. Posted up, simple past and past participle of post up. Post it, to edit and refine a computer-generated translation of a text. Post-edited. Simple past and past participle of post-edited. Post-editing. Present participle and gerund of post-edit. Post-editor. One who post-edits. Post-editors. Plural of post-editor. Post-edits. Third person singular simple present indicative of post-edit. Postee. One who posts an electronic message, a poster. Posteen. A sheepskin cloak. Posteens. Plural of posteen. Posties. Plural of postee. Post-haste. As fast as possible, with all possible haste. Post-ejaculatory. After ejaculation. Post-ejection. After ejection. Postal. A surname. Postal's law. The design principle that software should be conservative as to its own behavior, i.e. strictly compliant with specifications, but liberal in behavior it tolerates from other systems. Post-election. Occurring after an election. Post-electoral. After an election. Post-electronic. After the development of electronics. Post-electrophoretic. Following electrophoresis. Post-electroporation. Following electroporation. Post-elementary. After the elementary school level of education. Postel. A surname. Postelion. Of or relating to Guillaume Postal 1510-1581, French linguist, astronomer, Kabbalist, diplomat, professor, and religious universalist. Postels, plural of postel. Postals, plural of postal. Postema, a surname from West Frisian. Post-emancipation, after the Emancipation Proclamation. Posthumous, plural of postema. Post-embedding, embedding subsequent to another process. Post-embolization, alternative form of post-embolization. Post-embolization, after embolization. Post-embryo, a newly hatched arachnid. Post-embryogenesis, after embryogenesis. Post-embryogenic, following embryogenesis. Post-embryonal, synonym of post-embryonic. Post-embryonic, that follows the embryonic stage of development. Post-embryonically, following development of the embryo. Post-embryos, plural of post-embryo. Post-emergence, after the emergence of the plant being targeted. Post-emergency, after an emergency. Post-immigration, after emigration. Post-empiricism, post-positivism. Post-empiricist, an adherent of post-empiricism. Post-empiricists, plural of post-empiricists. Post-temporal, alternative form of post-temporal. Post-encephalitic, of or relating to post-encephalitis. Post-encephalitides, plural of post-encephalitis. Post-encephalitis, a form of Parkinsonism believed to be caused by a viral illness that triggers degeneration of the nerve cells in the substantia nigra and leads to encephalitis. Postencephalitic. Misspelling of postencephalitic. Postendocytic. Following endocytosis. Postendocytosis. Following endocytosis. Postendodontic. Following an endodontic procedure. Postendoscopic. Following endoscopy. Post-engagement. After engagement. Post-engraftment. Following engraftment. Post-entocrustic and posterior entocrustic. Post-entocrustids, plural of post-entocrustid. Post-entries, plural of post-entry. Post-entry, after entry into anything. Post-envenomation, after envenomation. Post-epidemic, after an epidemic. Post-epidural, after the administration of an epidural. Post-epileptic, after an attack of epilepsy. Post-episode, after an episode. Post-epistemological.
Invincible.
After the decline of epistemology. Post-equatorio, behind an imaginary line or plane that divides the front and back of the body. Poster, a surname. Poster boy, a male exemplar of some trait. Poster boys, plural of poster boy. Poster child, one who is a prototypical or quintessential example of something. Poster children, plural of poster child. Poster color, synonym of poster paint. Poster colors, plural of poster color. Poster girl, a female exemplar of some trait. Poster girls, plural of poster girl. Poster paint, a tempera paint, often with a type of gum water or glue size as its binder, and sometimes supplied in powdered form. Poster paints, plural of poster paint. Poster session, a scientific meeting where details of research projects are displayed on posters for participants to view. Poster sessions, plural of poster session. Poster stamp, a label resembling a postage stamp issued to advertise or commemorate a product or event. Poster stamps, plural of poster stamp. Poster board, cardboard material suitable for making posters. Poster boards, plural of poster board. Poster bought, alternative form of poster boy. Poster boys, plural of poster boy. Poster child, alternative spelling of poster child. Poster children, plural of poster child. Poster, simple past and past participle of poster.
Here we go.
Posterette, a small poster. Posterettes, plural of posterette. Pastilla, in a direction toward the posterior. Postering, the putting up of posters. Posterings, plural of postering. Posterior, alternative form of postero. Posterior, inferior. Posterior and inferior. Posterior central. Posterior and central. Posterior lateral, alternative form of posterolabial. Posterolateral, synonym of posterolateral. Posterolaterally, in a posterolateral manner or direction. Posterior medial, posterior and medial. Posterior median, posterior and median. Posterior, nearer the rear or hind end, nearer the caudal end of the body in quadrupeds or the dorsal end in bipeds. Posterior auricular arteries. Plural of posterior auricular artery. Posterior auricular artery. A small branch of the external carotid artery that supplies or gives off branches supplying the back of the ear and the adjacent region of the scalp, the middle ear, tympanic membrane, and mastoid cells. Posterior auricular muscle. Alternative form of auricularis posterior. Posterior auricular muscles. Plural of posterior auricular muscle. Posterior cerebral arteries. Plural of posterior cerebral artery. Posterior cerebral artery. An artery that arises by the terminal forking of the basilar artery where it forms the posterior portion of the circle of Willis and passes on to supply the lower surfaces of the temporal and occipital lobes. Posterior chamber. A narrow space inside the eye between the iris and the lens filled with aqueous humor. Posterior chambers. Plural of posterior chamber. Posterior cingulate cortex. The hind part of the cingulate cortex. It controls mind wandering and rumination. Posterior cingulate cortices. Plural of posterior cingulate cortex. Posterior communicating arteries. Plural of posterior communicating artery. Posterior communicating artery. Either of two arteries that occur one on each side of the circle of Willis and connect an internal carotid artery with a posterior cerebral artery. Posterior cricoarachnoid muscle. A muscle of the larynx that arises from the posterior surface of the lamina of the cricoid cartilage, inserts into the posterior of the process of the arachnoid cartilage, and widens the opening of the vocal cords. Posterior cruciate ligament. One of a pair of cruciate ligaments in the human knee. Posterior cruciate ligaments. Plural of posterior cruciate ligament. Posterior aphmudal arteries. Plural of posterior aphmudal artery. Posterior aphmudal artery. One of the arteries of the branching off the ophthalmic artery. Posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. Plural of posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Posterior inferior cerebellar artery. An artery that usually branches from the vertebral artery below its junction with the contralateral vertebral artery to form the basilar artery, and that supplies much of the medulla oblongata, the inferior portion of the cerebellum, and part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. Posterior clipping of posterior malleolus. Posterior malleolus. The distal posterior aspect of the tibia at the ankle. Posterior mal. Plural of posterior mal. Posterior nares. Plural of posterior nares. Posterior nares. Synonym of chona. Posterior palpabilities. Plural of posterior palpability. Posterior palpability. The probability of an event given the knowledge of occurrence of other events that bear on it. Pia B as contrasted to Pia, where A is the sought event and B is the sign or symptom event. Posterior scalene muscle. A muscle arising from the transverse processes of the 4th to 6th cervical vertebrae, inserting on the outer surface of the second rib, and functioning to raise the second rib and to bend and slightly rotate the neck. Posterior spinal arteries. Plural of posterior spinal artery. Posterior spinal artery. Either of two arteries of which one arises from a vertebral artery on each side below the level at which the corresponding branch of the anterior spinal artery arises, and which descend on the posterior lateral surface of the spinal cord along a line passing close to the entrance of the dorsal roots to the spinal cord. Posterior superior alveolar arteries. Plural of posterior superior alveolar artery. Posterior superior alveolar artery. A branch of the maxillary artery that supplies the upper molar and bicuspid teeth. Posterior triangle. A triangular region that is a landmark in the neck, has its apex above at the occipital bone, and is bounded in front by the sternocleidomastoid muscle, behind by the anterior margin of the trapezius, and inferiorly by the middle third of the clavicle. Posterior triangles. Plural of posterior triangle. Posteriorization. Alternative form of posteriorization. Posteriorizations. Plural of posteriorization. Posteriorize. Alternative form of posteriorize. Posteriorizing. Present participle and gerund of posteriorize. Posterioristic. Of or belonging or pertaining to the posterior analytics of Aristotle. Posteriorities. Plural of posteriority. Posteriority. The condition of being posterior in any sense. Posteriorization. The opposition of posterior values, especially the formation of the forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, and spinal cord from the anterior neural plate. Posteriorizations. Plural of posteriorization. Posteriorize. To achieve posteriorization. Posteriorize. Simple past and past participle of posteriorize. Posteriorizes. Third person singular simple present indicative of posteriorize. Posteriorizing. Present participle and gerund of posteriorize. Posteriorly. After in time. Posteriorost. Nears the posterior or back end. Posteriorness. They called it being posterior. Posterior parietal. Posterior and parietal. Posteriors. Plural of posterior. Posteriorward. In a posterior direction. Posteriorwards. Alternative form of posteriorward. Posterior. Obsolete form of posterior. Posteriorly. Obsolete form of posteriorly. Posteriors. Plural of posterior. Posterioventral. Alternative form of posteroventral. Posterioventrally. Alternative form of posteroventrally. Posterization. Alternative form of posterization. Posterizations. Plural of posterization. Posterize. Alternative spelling of posterize. Posterize. Simple past and past participle of posterize. Posterizes. Third person singular simple present indicative of posterize. Posterish. Resembling or characteristic of a poster, especially in having a bold, colorful design. Posterishness. The quality of being posterish. Posterizing. Present participle and gerund of posterize. Posterous. A person who designs posters. Posterists. Plural of posterous. Posterity. Obsolete spelling of posterity. Posterities. Plural of posterity. Posterity. All the future generations, especially the descendants of a specific person. Posterization. The act or process of posterizing. Posterizations. Plural of posterization. Posterize. To reduce the number of colors in an image, changing a continuous gradation of tone to several regions of fewer tones, with abrupt changes from one tone to another. Posterize. Simple past and past participle of posterize. Posterizes. Third person singular simple present indicative of posterize. Posterizing. Present participle and gerund of posterize. Poster-like. Having the character of a poster, iconic. Poster. A back gate, back door, side entrance, or other gateway distinct from the main entrance, especially in the city wall or fortification. Posterns, plural of poster. Postero, posterior, back. Posterolateral. Alternative spelling of posterolateral. Posteroventrolateral. Alternative form of posteroventrolateral. Posteroventrolaterally. Alternative form of posteroventrolaterally. Posterior. Posterior to anterior, back to front. Posteropical. Posterior to an apex. Posteropically. In a posteropical manner or direction. Posteropesal. Posterior and basal. Posterobucally. Misspelling of posterobically. Posteropical. Relating to the posterior of the cheek. Posterobically. In a posteropical manner. Posterocaudal. Posterior and caudal. Posterocentral. Posterior and central. Posterocnid. A posterior hypoconid. Posterocnids, plural of posterocnid. Posterocortical. Posterior and cortical. Posterocranial. Posterior and cranial. Posterocostal. Away from and behind the main part. Posterocostally. In a posterocostal direction. Posterodorsal. Relating to the back of the upper surface of an organ, etc. Posterodorsally. In a posterodorsal direction. Posterodorsals. Plural of posterodorsal. Posterodorsolateral. Posterior and dorsolateral. Posterodorsolaterally. In a posterodorsolateral direction. Posterodorsomedial. Posterior and dorsomedial. Posterodorsomedial. Alternative form of posterodorsomedial. Posterexternal. Posterior and external. Posteroflexid. A flexid between the posterolifid and the metaconid. Posteroflexids. Plural of posteroflexid. Posteroflexus. A flexus between the posterolif and the metacone. Posterofrontal. Relating to posterior and frontal regions. Posterograde. Synonym of retrograde. Posteroinferior. Situated back and below. Posteroinferiorly. In a posteroinferior direction. Posterointermediate. Position between posteromedial and posterolateral positions. Posterointernal. Posterior and internal. Posterolabial. Posterior and labial. Posterolabially. In a posterolabial orientation. Posterolateral. Situated on the side and toward the posterior aspect. Posterolaterally. In a posterolateral manner. Posterolaterodorsal. Posterior and laterodorsal. Posterolateroventral. Posterior and lateroventral. Posterolateroventral. In a posterolateroventral manner or direction. Posterolingual. Relating to or attached to the base of the tongue. Posterolingually. Towards or via the base of the tongue. Posteroloff. A crest at the back of the molar connected to the hypocone. Posterolifid. A crest at the back of the molar connected to the hypoconid. Posterolifids. Plural of posterolos. Plural of posterolol. Posteromedial. In the back and near the midline. Posteromedial. In a posteromedial manner. Posteromedial. Both central and posterior. Posteronsal. Posteromedial. Posteromesial. plantar manner or direction. Posterior-proximal, posterior and proximal. Posterior-proximally, in a posterior-proximal manner or direction. Posterior-Rolandic, posterior to the Rolandic fissure in the brain now called the central sulcus. Posterostal, relating to the posterostum. Posterostum, the ostium of the coronary sinus. Posterosinusid, a small crest between the hypollophulid and the posterolfid. Posterosinusids, plural of posterosinusid. Posterostile, a crest on the posterolabial corner of the molar. Posterostiles, plural of posterostile. Posterostilid, a crest on the posterolingual corner of the molar. Posterostilids, plural of posterostilid. Posterosublateral, posterior and sublateral. Posterosomedial, posterior and somedial. Posterosuperior, behind and above. Posterosuperiorly, in a posterosuperior manner or direction. Posteroventrad, in both a posterior and ventral direction. Posteroventral, both posterior and ventral. Posteroventrally, in a posteroventral direction. Posteroventrals, plural of posteroventral. Posteroventricular, posterior and ventricular. Posteroventrolateral, posterior and ventrolateral. Posteroventrolaterally, in a posteroventrolateral direction. Posteroventromedial, posterior and ventromedial or posteroventral and medial. Posters, plural of poster. Post-eruption, after a volcanic eruption. Post-eruptive, after an eruption. Post-eruptively, in a post-eruptive manner. Postery, resembling or characteristic of a poster. Post-esophageal, posterior esophagus. Postessive, indicating a position behind something. Possessive case, the grammatical case that is possessive. Postus, second person singular simple present indicative of posts. Postestimation, estimation following some other process. Postestimations, plural of postestimation. Postestrogenization, following estrogenization. Postestrus, alternative form of postostrus. Poste. Third person singular simple present indicative of posts. Postethnic, pertaining to a time or mindset in which ethnic identity is no longer important. Post-evaluative, after evaluation. Post-event, following a usually specified event. Post-everything, after every style, belief, or attitude, thoroughly modern. Post-exapophysis, an exapophysis attached to a condyle. Post-excision, after excision. Post-excretion, following excretion. Post-execution, after execution the government-sanctioned killing of a criminal. Post-exercise, that follows exercise physical activity. Post-exertional, after physical exertion. Post-exhaustion, occurring after a state of exhaustion. Post-exile, after exile. Post-exilian, after an exile, especially the biblical exile of the Jews. Post-exilic, after an exile, especially the biblical exile of the Jews. Post-exist, to exist after. Post-existed, Simple past and past participle of post-exist. Post-existence. Afterlife, subsequent existence. Post-existences. Plural of post-existence. Post-existent. Existing or living afterward. Post-existing. Present participle and gerund of post-exists. Post-exists. Third person singular simple present indicative of post-exists. Post-exocytotic. Following exocytosis. Post-expansion. After expansion. Post-experience. After an experience. Post-experiential. Following an experience. Post-experiment. Alternative form of post-experimental. Post-experimental. Following experimentation. Post-expiration. After expiration. Post-expiratory. Following expiration. Post-exponential. Following a period of exponential growth. Post-exposure. After exposure to radiation, pathogens, etc. Post-extension. Following extension. Post-extracted. Extracted after some other operation. Post-extraction. After extraction of, for example, a tooth. Post-extractional. Synonym of post-extraction. Post-extrasystole. The part of an irregular heartbeat rhythm following an extrasystole. Post-extrasystoles. Plural of post-extrasystole. Post-extrasystolic. Following an extrasystole, relating to a post-extrasystole. Post-extubation. Following extubation. Postface. A piece of text containing information normally included in a preface placed at the back of a publication. Postasis. Plural of postface. Post-act. After the fact, after something has happened. Post-factory. After a product leaves the factory. Post-factual. Alternative form of post-factual. Post-factum. Alternative form of post-factum. Post-fader. After audio processing by a fader. Post-failure. Following a failure. Post-fame. After having been famous but now forgotten. Post-familial. After the decline of the family as a social unit. Post-famine. After the Great Irish Famine. Post-fascism. A new form of fascism. Post-fascists. After fascism of or pertaining to post-fascism. Post-fascists. Plural of post-fascists. Post-fatigue. After a period of fatigue. Post-fatigue. After undergoing fatigue. Post-fault. After a fault. Post-east. Synonym of after-feast. Post-easts. Plural of post-feast. Post-febrile. After a fever. Post-federal. Of or relating to a period when cities in the United States can no longer rely on federal funding and must seek local sources. Posty. After feeding. Post-feedback. Following feedback. Post-feeding. After feeding. Post-feminism. Any of a wide range of theories that respond to feminism, arguing that it is no longer relevant or that it needs to be extended to fit the changing expectations and experiences of women. Post-feminisms. Plural of post-feminism. Post-feminists. Pertaining to post-feminism. Post-feminists. plural of postuminous. Postfemoral, posterior to the femur. Post-fermentation, following fermentation. Post-fertile, after the end of fertility. Post-fertilization, alternative form of post-fertilization. Post-fertilization, after fertilization. Post-fertilize, fertilized following some other procedure. Post-festive, following a festival. Post-fetal, after the fetal stage, after birth. Post-fetal, after feudalism. Post-fibrillatory, that occurs after ventricular or atrial fibrillation. Post-fibrinolysis, following fibrinolysis. Post-tight, occurring after or as a consequence of a fight. Postular, in text processing systems, a pattern of text that is expected to occur after the portion of interest. Postfilm, after watching a film. Postfilmic, after the introduction of the medium of film. Postfilter, to filter after some other process. Postfilter, simple past and past participle of postfilter. Postfiltering, present participle and gerund of postfilter. Postfilters, plural of postfilter. Postfiltration, after filtration. Postfinal, after an item or unit regarded as final. Postfinalization, after the finalization of an adoption, at the point of legal transfer of parental rights and withdrawal of supervision. Postfire, after a fire. Postfix, to suffix. Postfix notation, synonym of reverse Polish notation. Postfixal, relating to or taking the form of a postfix. Postfixated, alternative form of postfixed. Postfixation, a secondary fixation of a histological sample, often using osmium tetroxide to fixate lipids. Postfixations, plural of postfixation. Postfixative, following fixation. Postfix, simple past and past participle of postfix. Postfixes, plural of postfix. Postfixing, present participle and gerund of postfix. Postflame, after the formation of a flame. Postflare, after a flare. Postfledging, following fledging. Postflexion, after the flexion stage of larval development. Postflexural, the hind of flexure. Postflight, after a flight. Postfle, after a flood. Postallop, after the flop. Postflowering, that follows flowering. Postfolding, following folding of proteins or terrain. Postform, to shape or mold as a final stage of construction. Postformal, following the formal operational stage, the last of Jean Piaget's 4 stages of human cognitive development, and involving more complex forms of thinking such as self-reference, pragmatism, and acceptance of paradoxes. Postformalin, following treatment with formalin. Postformalism, application of the post-formal stage of cognitive development. Postformalists, applying the post-formal stage of cognitive development. Postformation, after formation of a business, an anatomical structure, etc. Postformational, following the formation of a new species. Postformative, a formative element at the end. Postformatives, plural of postformative. Postformed, simple past and past participle of postform. Postforming, present participle and gerund of postform. Postforms, plural of postform. Postfortification, following fortification. Postasset, a facet anterior to a metal, especially in the teeth of a horse. Postassets, plural of postasset. Postfoundational, of or relating to postfoundationalism. Postfoundationalism, a theory of epistemology denoting a rejection of an assumed or given authority for a specific action or belief, but arguing in dialectical fashion for a rationale for action or belief. Postfoundationalists, a supporter of postfoundationalism. Postfoundationalists, plural of postfoundationalists. Postfoundationally, in terms of postfoundationalism. Postfoval, a hindfophobia. Postfracture, after a bone fracture. Postfreeze, after the process of freezing something. Postfreezing, following freezing. Postfrons, the part of the frons of an insect above or behind the antennae. Postfrontal, behind the frontal bone. Postfrontals, plural of postfrontal. Postfec, occurring after a fuck, occurring after sex. Postfulguration, following fulguration. Postfunctionalization, the addition of a functional group after the body of a compound has been synthesized. Postfunctionalizations, plural of postfunctionalization. Postfuneral, after a funeral. Postfurca, one of the internal thoracic processes of the sternum of an insect. Postturkey, plural of postfurca. Postfurcal, relating to a postfurca. Postfusion, following fusion. Postfusional, following fusion. Postgadolinium, describing imaging effects observed following administration of gadolinium. Post-game, following a game, usually specifically a sporting match. Post-games, following an athletic festival, often specifically the Olympic Games. Postganglionary, beyond or behind a ganglion. Postganglionic, located distal or posterior to a ganglion. Postgallum, the period immediately following an postgasm, plural of postgasm. Postgastrectomy, after a gastrectomy. Postgastric, following gastric surgery. Postgastrulation, gastrulation. Postgay, serving. Postgabbage, following gout. Postgabbage, Post-genomics, any of various fields of study that are only possible after the publication of the genome of an organism. Post-geographic, no longer having a geographical basis. Post-grammarial, following production in the grammar. Post-terminal, posterior to the germinal center. Post-termination, occurring after germination. Post-termination, following germination. Post-terminal, following germination. Post-girl, a girl who delivers a post, young post. Post-girls, plural of post-girl. Post-chick, barrel, a gyro-financial descent. Post-gerals, plural of post-geral. Post-label, behind the glabella. Post-glacial, occurring after glaciation. Post-glacial rebound, rise of the lithosphere in areas depressed by the weight of the continental ice sheet during the last ice age. Post-glacial rebound, plural of post-glacial rebound. Post-glacial, after glaciation. Post-clenoid, situated behind the legular fossa of the temporal bone. Post-globular, following the globular stage. Post-globular, occurring or located after the globules. Post-pulsator, a legal scholar of the late Middle Ages, period after the Pulsators. Commentator, post-pulsators, plural of post-pulsator. Post-genite, either of a pair of terminalia laterally encircling the base phallus of a diptera. Post-genites, plural of post-genite. Post-gonopodal, posterior to a post-generic, following gonorrhea. Post-grad, abbreviation of postgraduate. Postgrads, plural of postgrad. Postgraduate, a person continuing study in the field after having successfully completed an degree course. Postgraduates, plural of postgraduate. Post-graduation, after graduation, the time after graduation. Post-grad, following congrats. Post-grad, grafted following some other operation. Post-grad, Post History is not, as Karl Marx described it, a class struggle, but rather a struggle to produce class.http:/10.1111/9856.00067. Post after hemiplegia, post hemorrhagic, following hemorrhage, post hepatectomy, following hepatectomy, post hepatic, steroids in the liver, post hepatic, after hepatitis, post phobia, fear,
Here we go. Post-hetemizing, present participle and gerund of post-hetemize. Post-hetemy, excision of the foreskin, post-hectomy, circumcision. Post-steoplasty, pertaining to post-steoplasty. Post-steoplastation, one who carries out a post-steoplasty. Post-steoplastation, plural of post-steoplastation. Post-steoplasty. Plural of post-steoplasty. Post-steoplasty. Surgical reconstruction of the foreskin. Post-steotomies. Plural of post-steotomy. Post-steotomies. Non-Oxford British. English Standard Spelling of post-steotomies. Post-steotomies. Simple past or past participle of post-steotomies. Post-steotomies. Third person singular simple present indicative of post-steotomies. Post-steotomizing. Present participle and gerund of post-steotomies. Post-steotomist. Someone who performs post-steotomies. Post-steotomist. Plural of post-steotomist. Post-steotomize. To perform post-steotomy on. Post-steotomize. Simple past and past participle of post-steotomy. Post-steotomizes. Third person singular simple present indicative of post-steotomize. Post-steotomizing. Present participle and gerund of post-steotomy. Post-steotomy. Alternative form of post-steotomy. Post-stubby. After they are post-department. Posterior to the hippocampus. Post-historic. Relating to post-history. Post-histories. Plural of post-history. Post-history. The history of events that occur after and are consequences of an event, for example, a crisis, a reconciliation, etc. Postitis. The inflammation of the foreskin or prepuce of the human penis. Characterized by swelling and redness on the skin. Post-hoc. Alternative form of post-hoc. force. Post-hospital, after a period spent in hospital. Post-hospitalization, alternative form of post-hospitalization. Post-hospitalization, occurring after hospitalization. Post-house, a company that carries out post-production. Post-houses, plural of post-house. Post-human, succeeding human beings is presently defined more than or beyond what is human. Post-humanism, any various schools of that proposed earlier humanism. Post-humanism, plural of post-humanism. Post-humanists, one who subscribes to post-humanism. Post-humanists, plural of post-humanists. Post-humanities, plural of post-humanity. Post-humanity, quality or condition of being post-human. Post-humans,
Invincible.
plural of post-human. Post-humiliation, after humiliation. Post-humans, after the death of someone. Posthumous execution, ritual desecration of the body of the dead person for punishment. Posthumous execution, plural of posthumous execution. Posthumous name, a respectful alias used in Chinese or sometimes more broadly East Asian contexts to refer to a dead person, particularly one. Posthumous names, plural of posthumous name. Posthumous, after death. Posthumousness, quality of being posthumous. Hurricane. Post-hybridization, following hybridization. Post-hybridized, hybridized after some other operation. Post-hydration, following hydration. Post-dioi, kasir to the hayatun. Post-hyperventilation, alternative form of post-hyperventilation. Post-hypnosis, after hypnosis. Post-hypnotic, after being hypnotized. Post-hypnotic suggestion, a suggestion given to a hypnotized person to perform some action after waking, especially in response to a fear. Post-hypnotic suggestion, plural. Post-hypnotic suggestion. Post-hypnotically, in a post-hypnotic post-hypocrisy, dental feature in the hypocrisy. Post-hypocrisy, plural of post-hypocrisy. Post-hypoglycemia, alternative form of post-hypoglycemia. Post-hypoglycemia, after hypoglycemia.
Here we go.
Plural of post-hypophysis. Post-hypophysis, the posterior lobe of the pituitary body. Post-hypostotic, posterior to a hypostome. Post-hypoxic, following hypoxia. Post-hysterical, following hysteria. Post-hysteroscopic, following hysteroscopy. Post-hysteroscopic, alternative form of post-hysteroscopic. Post-stigma, post-stigma, oriented towards the base. Post-stigma, in a post-stig oriented patient. Post-stigma, any item of false hair worn on the head. Face, such as a false beard or wig. Post-stitches, plural of postage. Post-dissipate, to do something later. When the time has come. Posticus, posterior. Posticously, posteriorly. Posticto, occur, and after an epileptic seizure. Postictively, occurring after an epileptic seizure. Post-icteric, following jaw disease. Post-ideological, after ideology, an attack on ideology.
Postulation, the act of postulating, exposition of scripture and preaching. Postulations, plural of postulation. Postulator, someone who postulates, one who expounds the scriptures verse by verse. Postulator, plural of postulate. Postulate, simple past and past participle. Postal. Postular, a writer of notes in the margin of a book. Postulars, plural of postular. Postulang, present participle and gerund of postal. Postillion, alternative spelling of postillion. Postillions, plural of postillion, alternative spelling of postillions. Post-illumination, following illumination. Postils, plural of postil. Post-immersion, following immersion in water with the danger of drowning. Post-immigration, after immigration. Post-immune, following an immune response. Post-immunization, alternative form of post-immunization. Post-immunization, after immunization. Post-impact, after an impact. Post-imperative. Following a command. Post-imperial, after the period of an empire. Post-implant, after an implant. Post-implantation, following implantation. Post-implementation, after implementation. Post-impressionism, a genre of painting that rejected the naturalism of impressionism, using color and form in more expressive manners. Post-impressionists, of or pertaining to post-impressionism. Post-impressionistic, post-impressionists. Post-impressionists, plural of post-impressionists. Post-imputation, following imputation. Postin, alternative form of postine. Post-inaugural, after inauguration. Post-incisional, after a surgical incision. Post-inclusion, after inclusion. Post-increment, alternative form of post-increment. Post-incubation, after incubation. Post-independence, occurring after a country has achieved independence. Post-Indian, a Native American. Post-Indians, plural of post-Indian. Post-indictment, after an indictment. Post-induction, following induction. Post-inductional, following induction. Post-industrial, describing the economy of a nation in which manufacturing industry becomes less important and the service and information industries become more important. Post-industrialization, alternative form of post-industrialization. Post-industrialization, the period marked by decline in industrialization and a social movement from blue-collar to white-collar jobs. Post-industrially, in a post-industrial context, following industrialization. Post-infarct, after an infarct. Post-infarcted, that has been affected by myocardial infarction. Post-infarction, after infarction. Post-infection, occurring after an infection. Post-infectional, after infection. Post-infections, plural of post-infection. Post-infectious, following an infection. Post-infectiously, in a post-infectious manner. Post-infective, relating to post-infection. Post-infestation, following infestation. Post-infiltration. Following infiltration. Post-inflammatory. After inflammation. Post-inflationary. After inflation. Post-inflectional. After inflection. Post-influenza. Following influenza. Post-influenzal. After influenza. Post-information. After the receipt of information. Post-infraorbital. A group of dermal bones located posterior to the orbit in some vertebrates. Post-infraorbitals. Plural of post-infraorbital. Post-infundibular. Behind an infundibulum. Post-infusion. Following infusion using a catheter. Posting. Present participle and gerund of post. Posting. Present participle and gerund of post. Posting date. Used other than figuratively or idiomatically. See posting date. Posting dates. Plural of posting date. Posting house. Alternative form of post house. Posting houses. Plural of posting house. Posting in. A post house. Posting off. Present participle and gerund of post off. Posting the coal. Present participle and gerund of post the coal. Posting up. Present participle and gerund of post up. Post-ingestion. After ingestion. Post-ingestive. Following ingestion. Postings. Plural of posting. Post-inhibitory. Following inhibition. Post-initiation. Occurring after initiation. Post-injection. After an injection is administered. Post-injections. Plural of post-injection. Post-injury. After injury. Post-inoculation. Following inoculation. Postins. Plural of postin. Post-insemination. Following insemination. Post-insertion. After insertion. Post-insertional. After an insertion. Post-inspection. After inspection. Post-institutional. After time spent in an institution. Post-institutionalize. Following being institutionalized. Post-instruction. After being instructed or taught. Post-instrumentation. Following instrumentation. Post-integration. Occurring after integration. Post-integrational. Alternative form of post-integration. Post-integrative. Following integration. Post-internalization. Following internalization. Post-internet. Society and modes of interaction following the widespread adoption of the Internet, especially in arts and criticism. Post-intervention. After intervention. Post-interventional. After intervention. Post-interventionally. Following intervention. Post-interview. After an interview. Post-intestinal. Situated posterior to the intestines. Post-intoxication. After intoxication. Post-intracoronary. Following intracoronary surgery. Post-intraperitoneal. Following intraperitoneal surgery. Post-introduction. After the introduction of something. Post-introductory. After the introduction of something. Post-intubation. After intubation. Post-invasion. Following an invasion. Post-invasive, following invasion. Postique, a retail store selling items relating to postal mail, such as stamps and stationery. Postiques, plural of postique. Postyronic, alternative form of postironic. Postironies, plural of postirony. Postirony, alternative form of postirony. Post-irradiated, irradiated after another operation. Post-radiation, after irradiation. Post-ischemic, alternative form of post-ischemic. Post-ischemia, after an ischemia. Post-ischemic, following or caused by ischemia. Post-ischial, posterior to ischium. Post-isolation, occurring after a period of isolation. Post-isometric, following isometric exercise. Post-jail, alternative spelling of post-jail. Post-dash, used to contrast with prejudge, to judge after the fact. Post-dash, simple past and past participle of post-judge. Post-datus, third person singular simple present indicative of post-judge. Post-dating, present participle and gerund of post-judge. Post-judgment, alternative form of post-judgment. Post-judice, an opinion or bias acquired after the fact. Post-judgment, alternative form of post-judgment. Post-judice, an opinion or bias acquired after the fact or after a given event. Post-judices, plural of post-judice. Post-jump, after a jump. Post-junctional, behind the neuromuscular junction. Post-junctionally, in a post-junctional manner. Post-juvenile, describing a bird's molt that follows the juvenile phase. Post-juvenile, alternative form of post-juvenile. Post-gymatic, after a significant phase of deformation. Post-lab, after a laboratory session. Post-labial, behind the lips. Post-labs, plural of post-lab. Post-lactating, that has ceased lactating. Post-lactational, following lactation. Post-ladies, plural of post-lady. Post-lady, alternative spelling of post-lady. Post-laminar, posterior to the layer of capillaries in the choroid of the eye. Post-laminectomy, after a laminectomy. Post-landing, after the landing of a vessel or vehicle. Post-lapsarian, pertaining to any anything which follows a lapse or failure. Post-larva, the stage in the development of bony fish, following the larval stage, in which the yolk sac is resorbed and juvenile characteristics appear. Post-larvae, plural of post-larva. Post-larval, following a larval stage. Post-laryngeo, posterior to the larynx. Post-lunch, after a lunch. Post-layoff, occurring after or as a consequence of a layoff. Postal, a surname from Middle English. Post-lecture, after a lecture. Post-ovo, after the legal phase, especially of adoption. Postal legislation, after the introduction of legislation. Postal legislative, after the introduction of legislation. Postals, plural of postal. Postilion, after a lesion. Postiliano, after a lesion. Postless, without post-separate supports. Postal-weight, a surname. Post-await, a surname. Post awaits. Plural of post await. Postoxical. Following application of a lexical rule. Postliteral.